In the early 1980s, the USSR, once a superpower, began to show signs of strain. The glittering facade of unity and strength was starting to crack, revealing an underbelly of economic stagnation and political unease. The nation had been under the stewardship of Leonid Brezhnev for nearly 2 decades. His era, often referred to as the period of stagnation, was marked by a slowing economy and a lack of innovation. Despite the USSR's vast natural resources and manpower, the country was crippled by inefficiency, corruption, and an overly bureaucratic system that stifled progress. The situation was further exacerbated by the Soviet Union's involvement in the Afghan War. The war drained the Soviet economy, with resources being funneled into a conflict that seemed to have no end. It also took a heavy toll on Soviet morale as the human cost of the war became increasingly apparent. In the midst of this turmoil, a new leader emerged. Mikhail Gorbachev, a charismatic and reform-minded politician, took the reins of power in 1985. Gorbachev recognized the need for change and introduced 2 key policies: glasnost or openness, and perestroika or restructuring. Glasnost sought to increase transparency and freedom of speech in a society that had long been shrouded in secrecy. It challenged the status quo, encouraging criticism of the government and allowing for open discussion of social and political issues. Perestroika, on the other hand, aimed to revitalize the Soviet economy through reforms. It sought to reduce the control of the central government over the economy, promote small-scale private enterprise, and encourage innovation. These policies represented a significant shift in Soviet ideology. They were a breath of fresh air in a nation suffocating under the weight of its own bureaucracy and stagnation. However, they also exposed the deep-seated problems within the Soviet system. Gorbachev's reforms, while well-intentioned, inadvertently set the stage for the USSR's downfall. By the late 1980s, the cracks in the Soviet Union were impossible to ignore. A wave of unrest was sweeping across the vast expanse of the USSR, from the Baltic republics in the west to the Central Asian states in the east. This unrest was not a sudden eruption, but rather the culmination of years of growing discontent. The Soviet citizens for too long had been bearing the brunt of a system that was increasingly seen as corrupt and inefficient. They were tired, they were frustrated, and they were ready for change. One of the most significant catalysts of this change was the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. The government's attempt to downplay the severity of the disaster did nothing but fuel the flames of distrust among the people. The veil of secrecy that the Soviet government had so meticulously maintained was torn apart, exposing a system that was not only incapable of preventing such a catastrophe, but was also unwilling to deal with its aftermath in a transparent and responsible manner. Parallel to the internal turmoil was the external pressure exerted by the changing global political landscape. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union, further challenging its ideological foundations. The wall, a symbol of division and control, had crumbled, and with it, the belief in the invincibility of the Soviet system was severely shaken. The increasing unrest in the various republics was not just a protest against economic hardships or political corruption. It was a cry for freedom, for sovereignty, and for a life of dignity. The centralized control that Moscow had so tightly held was slipping away. Republics like Ukraine, Lithuania, Estonia, among others, were demanding greater autonomy, pushing for policies that were more in line with their unique ethnic, cultural, and economic identities. The USSR was no longer a united entity, but a collection of republics pulling in different directions. The dominoes had started to fall, and there was no stopping them. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not just imminent, it was inevitable. The year 1991 was a turbulent one for the Soviet Union. The winds of change were not just blowing across the Soviet Union, they were practically tearing it apart. In August of that year, hardline communists staged a coup against the then Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Their aim? To halt Gorbachev's reformist policies that were slowly but surely dismantling the authoritarian grip of the Communist Party. However, the coup was short-lived, lasting a mere 3 days. It was a colossal failure that not only weakened Gorbachev's position, but also accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. You see, the failed coup had an unintended consequence. It gave a significant boost to the rising star of Russian politics, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was then serving as the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. He famously climbed atop a tank, defying the coup plotters and rallying the public against them. This act of defiance propelled him to the forefront of Russian politics. In December 1991, leaders of 3 of the 15 Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, secretly met in Belovezha Forest. There they signed the Belovezha Accords, a document that declared the Soviet Union as ceasing to exist and established the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place. This marked the official dissolution of the USSR. Gorbachev, who was still clinging to the idea of a reformed Soviet Union, was left with no choice but to resign. On December 25th, he announced his resignation as president of the Soviet Union. The next day, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. Boris Yeltsin took over as the president of the newly established Russian Federation. He inherited a country in economic turmoil and a political landscape in flux. But that's a story for another time. On December 26, 1991, the USSR officially ceased to exist. The world watched as one of the most powerful empires of the 20th century crumbled, marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new geopolitical order. The collapse of the Soviet Union sent shockwaves around the world. A seismic shift in global dynamics, the aftermath of the dissolution was far-reaching and profoundly impactful. In the immediate wake of the collapse, the former republics of the USSR were thrust into a new era of uncertainty and change. They found themselves on the precipice of a daunting task: the need to construct new national identities, to create independent political systems, and to manage economies that had been for so long a part of a centrally planned system. Russia, the heart of the former Soviet Union, faced its own unique set of challenges. The country was tasked with transforming a state-controlled economy into a market-driven one. This transition was fraught with difficulties, leading to a severe economic crisis in the late 90s. The sudden liberalization of prices resulted in hyperinflation, wiping out the savings of millions. The economic instability was further compounded by the rise of oligarchs, who amassed tremendous wealth and power at the expense of the wider population. Politically, the post-Soviet era in Russia was marked by a struggle to establish a democratic system amidst a legacy of authoritarian rule. Despite the promise of political freedom, the reality was a tumultuous journey, with the country oscillating between democracy and autocracy. On a global scale, the end of the USSR signaled the conclusion of the Cold War, a period that had been characterized by ideological clashes and a tense nuclear arms race. The world heaved a sigh of relief as the threat of a nuclear apocalypse receded. The end of the Cold War also paved the way for the United States to emerge as the sole superpower, fundamentally altering the global balance of power. In essence, the aftermath of the USSR's collapse was a period of immense turbulence and transformation. It was a time of great hardship for many, but also a time of possibility, as new nations emerged from the ashes of the old. The collapse of the USSR marked the end of an era, dramatically reshaping the world as we know it. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a complex event with far-reaching consequences. To encapsulate the enormity of this historical occurrence, we need to reflect upon the key points we've discussed. The Soviet Union's story is one of economic stagnation, a situation that deteriorated over time and led to a general sense of disillusionment among the population. As resources became scarce, living standards dropped, and the economy suffered. Then came the long and arduous Afghan War, a conflict that drained precious resources and tarnished the Soviet Union's international reputation. It was a war that seemed to have no end and no victory, leading to further disillusionment and discontent. Meanwhile, Gorbachev's reforms, while intended to instigate positive change, ironically hastened the Union's decline. Glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, the restructuring of the economy, were radical and ambitious. However, they inadvertently opened the floodgates for public criticism and dissatisfaction, further destabilizing the already unsteady Union. The Chernobyl disaster was another pivotal moment, an event that shook the world and shed light on the dire state of the Soviet Union's infrastructure. The fallout from this nuclear catastrophe was felt far beyond the immediate area, both physically and symbolically. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a monumental event that marked a turning point in the Cold War. It symbolized the end of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe and the beginning of a new era of freedom and democracy. Then came the attempted coup, a desperate and ultimately unsuccessful bid to preserve the Soviet Union. It only served to fuel the flames of unrest. leading to the Belavasia Accords, which effectively dissolved the Union. Finally, the rise of Boris Yeltsin marked a new chapter in Russian history. His ascendancy symbolized the end of one era and the beginning of another, filled with uncertainty, change, and hope. The USSR's collapse remains one of the most significant events in recent history, the effects of which continue to be felt today.